Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this Limited video we're going to be discussing 3 pieces of news. The first of which is that Quake Champions is going to support Vulkan and also optimized for Ryzen processors. Speaking of Ryzen processors, the second thing we're going to discuss is various leaks have appeared showing the performance of various Ryzen 3 and 5 CPUs. We'll get into that in a minute, and we'll finalise the video with news concerning the RX 500 series, because both Sapphire and Asus have leaked, in massive quotation marks, their lineup. Not on camera today because I am around Amy's house, but normal service shall resume pretty quickly. Had to pick up a Ryzen build that is owned by the channel, so that's now going to be coming back to me in my place, so I can do more testing on the whole BIOS situation, and also test out a few other bits and pieces that you guys have been asking me for example, AMD cards in Ryzen versus Nvidia stuff, and a whole bunch of other stuff, but we'll go into that later. So, let's talk first of all about Quake Champions. Now, just so we're all clear, this is not built, which kind of surprised me actually when I first heard of it, on id Tech 6. Instead, it's going to require the creation of a proprietary new engine, at least that's what I'm hearing. But regardless, it will be taking full advantage of Vulkan. Not really surprising, given that it have been so successful with Vulkan when it comes to, of course, Doom. Now, there is a fallback, however, which is regular standard old OpenGL, which also really isn't surprising. However, let's be honest, Vulkan is pretty well supported at this point, so any modern, reasonably modern operating system or GPU is certainly going to support it. The interesting thing, however, is there is an agreement, of course, between Bethesda and AMD, and this most likely points to hefty optimizations for the Ryzen processors. Now, before anyone with an Intel CPU starts panicking, that doesn't mean you're suddenly going to get penalized. It's probably going to run just as you would expect, but it will probably also scale rather nicely with more CPU cores. For example, it will be able to scale additional work on those cores with perhaps rendering tasks or physics or whatever. And it'll be interesting to do some testing on that. I'm really hoping there'll be a built-in benchmark utility in this application. If not, it'll be somewhat less cool, but still. Now, let's talk about Ryzen 3 and Ryzen 5. So, some interesting stuff has popped up concerning Ryzen 3. Specifically, Ryzen 3 1200 we'll start out with, because we have some specifications of it, not too much, but then we'll move on to some other Ryzen stuff. So according to ASRock, AMD are preparing the Ryzen 3 CPU, one specific model, with a base frequency of 3.1 GHz. The model is listed as having a TDP of just 65 watts, and we don't know a couple of things. The first thing we don't know is whether it supports SMT, simultaneous multi-threading, or XFR. What does that mean? Well, first of which is that, theoretically, we could have a CPU here which only has 4 threads available. So it has 4 cores, 4 threads, nothing else. The second is that it might not have extended frequency range, which basically means overclocking. Well, it's going to be questionable. I'm going to make the assumption from what AMD have said in the past, user overclocking is going to be fine, but automatic overclocking probably not so much. Switching things to a different gear, however, a couple of Ryzen 5 reviews have leaked online. I won't read all of the results, but for one, for example, is Ryzen 5 1600, which the folks over at El Chupaz, which I'm probably butchering the name of that, but anyway, managed to grab hold of. So, Ryzen 5 1600 is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, and it's essentially the same CPU as a Ryzen 5 1600X, but of course with the normal differences between an X and a regular CPU, and the primary difference for most folks would be the fact that it turbos 400 MHz slower. It's also a little bit cheaper, not that much cheaper, than the 1600X, and that's actually one issue I do have with the Ryzen 5s. Most of the time, only let's say $20 or $30 separates one SKU from a different SKU. Regardless, it is what it is. So, they did test with a MSI X370 X-Power Gaming Titanium, but they could not get the memory clocks above 2400 MHz. I would love to know what BIOS they were using for that, to be totally honest with you. And they were using 4 sticks of memory as well, so that might also have been another issue, as well as a GTX 1070. Now, the results are pretty much in step with how you could imagine. So, applications which are severely multi-threaded, not that severely is a bad thing, but you get the idea, are pretty damn fast on a 6-core 12-thread processor. Gaming results are a little bit different, and in those instances, yes, it does definitely lag behind some Intel CPUs. I do have a couple of issues with this, however, and you can probably imagine what those are immediately. The first is I do wonder what what BIOS revision they were using. Now, for folks who don't know, I put out a different video which shows a massive increase in frame rate, and I have a feeling they were testing on the board revision that might be about 1.2 or 1.26. Simply because they're getting around 90-ish frames a second in Rise of the Tomb Raider DX12. I'm not saying they were. This is not an accusation. I'm just saying it's possible. Because, for me at least, when I went to 1.3, the frame rates went up quite significantly. But, obviously, I don't know the rest of the setup. So, because they were only able to get the memory at 2400 MHz, or perhaps something else in the system, the fact they were running a GTX 1070 perhaps, that might explain the discrepancy. But anyway, it is what it is. But, in my opinion anyway, the Ryzen is going to get better, obviously, over time as we see extra BIOS revisions released. But what is quite nice, if nothing else, you can take away the fact that it did clock to 3900 MHz, and this is on a Wraith cooler. That actually coincides very nicely with my own results with a 1700, which hit roughly the same clock speed, and roughly the same temperatures. In fact, I got mine to 3800 MHz as full disclosure. I just didn't want to push it any higher because I didn't have enough time, because I had to redo some BIOS, redo some tests because of the BIOS revision update that I said about just a few moments ago. Now, we have one final set of benchmarks for the Ryzen 5. This time it's for the 1400. So this is like the lowest end of the lowest end. This is going to cost about $170 US. I say about because once again your retailer might decide to gouge you a little bit. But this is a 4-core 8-thread CPU with a turbo clock, a boost clock if you prefer, of 3.4 GHz. And honestly the performance is pretty decent. It's with Cinebench R15 you're looking at 754 points ish, and if you start nudging them up, at a max clock speed, of around 3.8 GHz, they hit 801, which is not too bad. They don't, however, have many gaming performance ones. They've only got Firestrike, which, once again, well, you can see on screen anyway. But you're looking at around 7,000 points for Firestrike Ultra, which is not too bad, to be honest with you, considering the price of this CPU. The biggest issue I have with this processor, and I'm probably going to sound a bit like a broken record, is that the price difference is not enough for me. Like, I can cut, like, in my opinion anyway, the X model might be the worst. So I before it was released, I went on record and said I think that the X's are the best value. But I'm actually starting to change my mind after testing with the 1700 versus my 1700X Ryzen. 1700 MSI sent me, and I believe the overclocks are roughly the same from what I'm hearing. So if it's anything like that here, quite frankly, I would rather get the 1600, which has 6 cores, 12 threads, which is $220 US. That's compared to about $170 US for the 1400. Not only do you get higher boost clock out the gate, which means theoretically you're going to get slightly better overclocks, but ignore the overclocking potential just for a moment. The fact you've got an extra 4 threads available, that sounds a lot better to me. Once again, yes, it is, you know, about $50-ish more expensive, but I would rather spend $50 extra dollars to get those amount of extra threads. But that's just me. I want to finalize, I can't speak today, I'm having one of those days, this video by talking about some 500 series cards which are starting to pop up, especially from Sapphire. Basically, Sapphire managed to leak, and I don't necessarily know if I like the word leak, to be honest, but it is what it is, almost their entire lineup of SKUs, and they range from the 588GB model, which is the GDDR5 Nitro Plus, which features 2 HDMI, DVI, and 2 display ports, all the way down to the 550, which has just well, either 2 or a 4GB configuration of memory. And things are very much the same with Asus as well, as they have shown off the 580 ROG Strix, which is an 8GB card. As far as I can tell at the moment, most of the prices seem to be placeholders. For example, with the ROG Strix, it's about 320-ish pounds, which is a lot of money. Like, unless this is drastically faster than, let's say, the 480, and I don't mean just a little bit faster as in like the core clock rumours, I mean drastically faster. Well, I think that might be a bit expensive, but we'll just have to wait, unfortunately. Anyway, sorry for the bit of a bitsy video today, but it is what it is. As I said, I'm around Aim's house because we're collecting, or I'm collecting rather, the PC and doing a few other bits and pieces, but normal service shall resume in the next few days, and basically there will be a lot of testing and benchmarking going on, and also, of course, working on the Neil Trevitt interview tomorrow, so hopefully that will be up either tomorrow or the day after. It's about an hour long, so I have to A, edit it, and B, put up slides and stuff and a few other bits and pieces regarding it, clean the audio, because he's got a bit of background audio, a bit of background feedback on his end. It's not terrible, but if I could, I'd prefer to remove it, so I'm going to have a quick go on that. And just, well, other stuff as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.